Fantasy Pod. We are back for Season 2, presented by the good folks at DraftKings Sportsbook. I'm your host, Andre Simone, joined by my guy here, Justin Michael. We've got producer Kale behind the desk and mic'd up, he promises us. He's got takes, I know, and plenty of stuff to tell us about our rankings. We're doing things a little different this year, Justin. It's all about our listeners, all about our people. So during the season, we're really going to center that around your questions, our members' Discord. Have some fun with it because at the end of the day, fantasy is about having fun. But it's the preseason. It's late August. It's that time where drafts start, and we got to get you ready for that draft. J. Mike and I, we've got rankings for you. We haven't looked at each other's rankings. I'm told by producer Kale we should have quite a bit of debate here. So yeah, we are on differing sides of the aisle here.
Our rankings are all over the place.
What more could you ask for? What more could you ask for? 3 fresh perspectives, and yeah, you can troll us, celebrate us the entire year. We'll be happy to answer your questions, eat crow, the whole gamut on the football world, fantasy football, I should specify, world. Justin, how are you doing, my man?
I'm doing good, man. I'm just feeling excited. Football is in the air.
It's crazy.
It's about that time of year where they start playing old games on college football channels and the NFL Network and stuff like that. Been watching some classic playoff matchups, a couple of classic college football playoff games, and just kind of getting in that zone. And you know, nothing gets me in the football zone quite like fantasy football.
That's true.
It's amazing. Like, have you ever thought back just how many hours in your life you've spent thinking about fantasy football? Because it would probably be a little bit concerning.
No, I haven't. So much of my career is tied to having spent gajillions of hours thinking all this stuff through. Yeah, you're right, though. If I saw it on a...
But it's time well spent then.
It is time. That's what I think. Yeah, exactly. It's the other thing. It's the lack of knowledge in other fields that concerns me. If I ever let my mind go there, where it's like, wow, I've really severely limited my abilities as a human adult because I know all about sports and not so much about anything else.
Look, don't come to me with questions about how to fix your sink, about how to unclog your toilet. If your car breaks down, you're screwed. I'm not the guy. But if you have questions about your roster, if you want to know who's the sleeper on the Dallas Cowboys this fall, right. I am your man.
Among other amazing nuggets of knowledge that my guy here knows. And for that, DNVR Rams, DNVR Draft Podcast, lots of stuff that Justin Michael does that will be an asset to us, but not what we are here to do now. What we are here to do now is get you ready for your draft. We're going to start with running backs. Always the big, you figure out your 2 running backs in fantasy football.
It's your bread and butter. It's what took me to a championship game last year.
Absolutely. The rest of the stuff will kind of fall into place, but you figure out your running backs, your team's going to be very competitive. So, Justin, let's look at these rankings. And, Kale, do you want me to start with one of us? And we've got them all there, and you can compare them to the ADP. You can compare them.
Well, first we should tell everybody this is an aggregate ADP from
there you go.
Fantasy Pros. So
Love
this is
that.
Comparing the top 4 fantasy sites, ADPs, and it's making an aggregate. So we're trying to do a catch-all here.
And there you go. Kamara, Cook, McCaffrey, and a little bit. Justin, we are the most different. So what has you bullish on Dalvin Cook?
Well, one, he's a workhorse, right?
Yeah.
You know, that entire Minnesota offense, it's exciting. You've got good wide receivers, Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen. This is a Kubiak offense. It is all predicated on successfully running the football. They've got Clint in there now, Gary's son, former CSU Ram, shout out my guy.
Yep.
But, right.
Right.
when you looked at that Vikings offense last year, it all went through Dalvin Cook. They lived and died by him. He's coming off of a phenomenal season. Carried me to a championship game, so maybe personal experience kind of seeping into my mindset a little bit. But I just think if Minnesota is going to accomplish what they want to accomplish, it's got to be through Dalvin Cook. And I love a true, bell cow type running back, guys like him, Derrick Henry, where they are the clear-cut number 1 guy.
Well, I could see it, and I know people will be scared off by his injuries, but you lay out a very nice argument, and I think people are quick to forget that, just a year ago he was healthy, and he was one of the fantasy leaders in points by running backs. Unlike McCaffrey, who was injured, I think it's easy to kind of give Christian the pass, but everyone can get injured, especially at the running back position. And like in dynasties, this is more of a long-term play, but I have been worried about McCaffrey making a switch at some point, and all of a sudden you're legal listing him at wide receiver. That is going to hurt his value. I'm a big Kamara guy. The argument would be very similar to the argument I'd make for McCaffrey. He just has to carry more of that load on offense now. I love him for PPRs. And, I'm just a big fan of his explosiveness. I also think he's in that sweet spot. We'll get to a couple running backs where I think fantasy owners will be worried, like, is he just over the hump? Is this the year where I start to see some regression? Kamara, I think the asset is still, appreciating, right?
My only concern with Alvin Kamara, and he's phenomenal
way
talent,
down for you.
A phenomenal talent. Yeah. It's just the uncertainty at the quarterback position. Yep. No longer do you have Drew Brees to rely on. I thought, when you looked at his productivity with Taysom Hill last year, it went significantly down from when he was working with Drew Brees. I think it'll probably be Jameis this year when it's all said and done, and because of that, I would probably be willing to bump him up a little higher than I actually have him on my list here. But, I understand the hype in Kamara. I'm just the quarterback position. It worries me. You've got good defenses in that division that you're going up against. And then, just longevity. He's not the biggest guy in the world.
No, for sure. He, that's 100% true. And then I have Derrick Henry at 3. You have him at 2. We kind of agree. PPR, would you maybe bump him down below McCaffrey? Or are you that bullish on your fellow Roll Tider?
The thing that I love about Derrick Henry is he's going to get those red zone touches. And when it all comes down to touchdowns and you got a guy that, basically is going to get 25, 30 carries guaranteed on any game, I already like that. But just the added bonus of knowing, like, if they're inside the 5-yard line, they're giving that ball to Derrick Henry. They're not getting cute with it. And I love that. Again, like if you're in a PPR league, I do think you can justify Christian McCaffrey, even, Dalvin Cook like I did, who has the ability to catch the ball out of the backfield as well.
Right.
I love that Henry's going to be that work guy, though. I will say, and we'll dive into this in a little bit, I do think Tennessee's passing offense is going to kind of take a step up this year. So I wonder if maybe that hurts Henry's production to an extent. Yeah,
you add Julio.
Exactly. One of the best deep ball receivers. You already like what you've got working with Brown on the outside. But it looks like my guy Kale here wants to chip in.
I just was going to say, I'm bullish on Henry this year. I have him at 3 in my rankings or 2 in my rankings as well. I just think what's most important about Henry is how good he is down the stretch of the season. And when your playoffs are on the line, he's going to be getting 2 touchdowns a game, usually at least. I mean, that's a little bit over-exaggerating, but it's important.
It's not. It's spot on. It is spot on. Do you guys remember a couple of years ago when, what was it? Henry went for, it was like 5 touchdowns or like 300 yards in that.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I had him on the bench. And I got eliminated. So Derrick Henry is a closer. He is a guy you want on the field when it comes crunch time. And hands down, one of the worst fantasy football decisions I've ever made. I will defend it. He'd been playing really poorly for about 5 weeks going into that. But ever since that game, he's never slowed down, man.
No, he really hasn't. And then, I always think of him very similarly to Larry Johnson, who was one of those guys like, draft Larry Johnson first overall. And then eventually that year came where he just fell apart, and that was a wasted pick for you at fantasy.
When do the carries add up enough to where it's going to matter?
Right. And, I mean, King Henry's built different. Like, he's bigger than Von Miller.
He's not a normal human. I mean, When you see him standing next to Mark Ingram, who's objectively not a small human being, and he just completely dwarfs him.
Right.
I mean, it looks like he's like taking his son to a football game. It's absurd how large of a human he is.
Yeah, Mark Ingram, former Heisman, 6'1", 220, yeah.
It's also important to remember with Derrick Henry how few carries he got through his first 2.5 seasons in this league.
Yeah.
I mean,
Also
he really was not touching
Less
the
tread on
ball
the tires.
much. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's got a. I mean, don't get me wrong. He's made up for that by carrying a higher workload than any other back in the league over the last 2 years.
Absolutely.
But it's not like he's a typical guy 4 years into his running back career.
No, I agree. And even at Alabama, you can speak to this, Justin, kind of had the advantage of, they were so low. I mean, like
2014, he had quite a bit of carries. That was really the only year he had to be like the guy.
Right.
Other than that, it was
those
just a split.
squads, like Alvin Kamara had to transfer out of there. They were so loaded at running back, right?
That's so crazy, man.
It's nuts, but it's true. And so that's a great point on the tread on the tire. I frankly would love to see Tennessee utilize him more in the run game. I've always felt he's so efficient on those outside runs because he's
deceptively fast.
He's deceptively fast, and he's devastating in space, right?
Yeah, he does a really good job of understanding. Like when you watch him run, for a guy as big as he is, he's fluid in the open field, and he does a good job of just like slightly leaning to the right, and it's just enough to kind of make the linebacker roll off you. I mean, you already know he's big and strong, so if you don't get him square, you're not going to bring him down, and he's a freak. The more I talk about him, the more I'm like, how did I not have this guy as my running back one? But
I mean, honestly, I kind of regret talking it through right now, having him behind McCaffrey, because McCaffrey is coming off that injury. McCaffrey maybe shouldn't have that benefit.
Less proven at QB too.
Yeah, and it's why, for example, I'm lower on Saquon here, who you see all the way down at 10 for me. He has 7th for you, 7th on ADP. You're a little higher on him, Kale, having him 5th overall. I've seen ADP in some areas pretty high on Nick Chubb, 5th overall. None of us as that high on Chubb. I'm the highest with him at 6th. And that's the thing about running backs. It's always so hard. Oh, my bad. You do have him at 4. Good call by you. It is so hard to handicap those injuries, because someone's always coming off of one. Someone's always going to have one.
I'm also just worried. I know they both are paid at this point, but I'm just worried they're going to split too many carries. I am avoiding any backfield where I have a question of who the true number one is.
I mean, yeah.
They did a good job of mixing it up last year. As somebody that had Kareem Hunt on the roster, they did a pretty good job of feeding the hot hand, making sure both guys got a lot of... I mean, that's an offense that wants to run the football. For as much as people love to talk about OBJ and Landry, again, that is an offense where when they are at their best, it's downhill, it's feeding it to Chubb, it's playing ball control type football. It's not, let's have Baker sit back here and throw 60 times.
And I mean, it's another one of those... Who's coaching that offense? What tree are they coming from? Stefanski, Kubiak, Shanahan, the whole shebang. It's run first. That's the deal. That's why you're buying into Dalvin. That's why I'm very high on Aaron Jones still. Kind of think Green Bay's going to have a big year. A.J. Dillon probably scares me off. And the Dillon competition, more of a conversation for me in PPRs, or in standard, rather. Because PPR, even half point, Jones is just going to do
because he's good for 5 to 6 catches a game. I
100%.
mean, there were games last year where he wasn't tremendous by any means, but he would get like 100 yards rushing, rack up 6 or 7 catches for like 40 yards, maybe finish with a touchdown. And when it's all said and done, ends up with like a 20-point game. And all right, that's pretty good, all things considered.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so he might be less sexy, but Aaron Jones for me is one of the safer guys you can get. That's why I have him at 5, kind of ahead of some of these more injury risky Nick Chubb, guys like that. And look, I'm pretty high on Joe Mixon. That's probably where I differ most. I mean, we're right there, Justin, you and I, on Mixon, 8, 9.
He can play, guys. I mean, we can debate till we're blue in the face about like the off the field stuff and all that. And obviously that video was pretty horrific with Joe Mixon, but
The O-line concerns me more than any off-field stuff that happened back in
especially
college.
for fantasy.
Yeah, that's why I left him off my list. Is I just absolutely do not trust that Cincy O-line for anything.
It'd be hard too, but Zach Taylor's another of those guys who roundabout is from that same zone running scheme. And I think they understand with that offensive line, the only way we're going to salvage Joe Burrow is run, run, run. And Mixon is one of those few guys. We talked about bell cows. Mixon fits that bill, right?
He's
And I know
solid.
they've always
He's
had
not like a
Gio
huge
Bernard
dude, but he
around,
runs
though.
hard.
Yeah.
And he seems to be pretty durable, you know? Like he was one of
He's
those
been
guys
crazy
that
durable.
was taking some big shots, and he just gets up and he keeps on chugging. But I agree with what Kale said. I mean, I'm just everybody on this Bengals offense, whether you're excited about him, not Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, all
Right.
these guys, you know, you can talk yourself into it, but that offensive line just makes me nervous. With a even
it's
mediocre offensive
really
line, I
nerve-wracking.
probably have Mixon closer to like 6 or 7 on this list.
100%. We buy the talent. It's the team that really concerns us.
Yes.
The other thing is we buy the talent, we buy the workload. It's the team that concerns us.
Also true. Yeah, you know he's going to get the touches.
So
It's
he
just-
checks 2 of 3 boxes, but that third box he doesn't check concerning. Kale, is there any final points you would have us touch on before we move it along?
I just feel like we need to have the Ezekiel Elliott conversation about how you guys feel, because Dre and I are way lower on him than Justin and ADP is.
Yeah. The case for Zeke, is it a simple one, Justin?
It's touchdowns, man.
Yeah.
It's red zone looks. He's going to get a lot of looks. Now, you do worry a little bit, given that Dallas's passing offense has the potential to be so electric.
Yeah.
They have, if not the best, one of the best wide receiving cores in the NFL with Cooper, Gallup, and CeeDee Lamb.
Oof.
I don't know, man. I feel like Zeke's due. Really, it's kind of just a gut feeling. I think that offense is going to have to run the football, especially, you know, you're worried about Dak's health and like him holding up. I think being able to rely on that running game, especially over these first like 2 months when you're not exactly sure how healthy Dak is, I think that'd be a big advantage. And I just think he's in a big year. My big concern with him obviously is just fumbles. You know, he's been a guy who's not been able to hold on to the football in his career.
Yeah, and that's one of those offenses I have
It could be really good, man, and
It's
they
not
could be
even
like
the
20 points a
offense.
game, and it
Right,
wouldn't surprise
well,
me either.
True. That's true. It's just I get a feeling they'll be underwhelming. They won't be as good as the sum of their parts, and Zeke will be part of that. Now, all the things you've said, absolutely correct, and it's why he's still 9th, you know?
Yeah.
And I think on my, like, top 50 overall, he's 18th. There you go. So, I mean, it's not like Jonathan Taylor, who's top 10 in ADP, and yet I think
That's who I want to get into after
didn't
this week.
appear
Yeah.
anywhere else. So there seems to be a consensus. But yeah, Zeke's a tricky one. And I wonder if he's kind of over the hump at this point. I really do.
I do think that's fair. I think he's got 1 or 2 good seasons left in him. But just briefly here before we move on, you mentioned Jonathan Taylor. He's a guy that I've seen ranked as high as like the second best running back coming in by certain, you know,
Yes.
fantasy outlets. A couple
Yes.
of magazines that I read had him ranked at number 2. I know that he flashed, but that seems way too high for me based on what we've seen with some of these other backs. Where are you guys at with Jonathan Taylor? And is he a guy that, you know, could be a 8 to 10 touchdowns this season, you know, 1,300 yards?
I'm pretty high on Jonathan Taylor just because I really believe in that offensive line, and I know that team's mentality is going to be run first and play action based because of who their quarterback is. So I think he's going to be really good from that perspective, but I do understand your concerns. He flashed in the pan last year. I have him ranked right next to Swift as well, who I also really like that. I also really like that offensive line, but DeAndre Swift has some injury concerns as well. I know that's like a hot take from me. He's in my
Swift. I love Swift.
He was my. This is more me being bullish. He was my favorite running back going into last year's draft. So
Somebody's gonna flash, man. If you believe in somebody, put your stock behind them. You know, it's like Trey McBride on CSU. People for the last year have rolled their eyes, been like, "You're just a CSU guy." I'm like, no, he's the best tight end I've ever seen in person. You know, at least in person.
You've
I want to
heard
have
it
that.
from legit scouts too. Boy, the two sides of Jonathan Taylor are really interesting to me. Because he is, in standard leagues, the 4th highest scoring running back in all fantasy football last year, which I think would be surprising.
That was kind of quietly really productive.
Super quietly, and not even really he just got 20 carries every game and was getting 60 yards and maybe a garbage touchdown here, something there, 5 receptions. So
there is value in that, though. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, if you can find those running backs, especially if he's your number 2 guy. Like, let's say you land a top 5 running back on top of it, but Taylor's your second guy, and you're able to scrape out 15 points a week out of him just purely on volume of touches and, a garbage time touchdown here. You could be in a pretty good position.
Well, especially if you have any injuries like last year that happened to the running back position as a whole, which was just decimated. If this season's anything like last year, which it probably will be with all the COVID stuff, again, Jonathan Taylor is a really safe play. I get it.
Yeah. So he's got that going for him. My problem is he did not look good at actual football last year. So the production was there, but it was like consistently on 2.8 yards per carry, 3.2. And when you're playing like that and you're at running back, your leash is about this long. And Nyheim Hines was injured most of last year. When he was healthy, he looked like the bigger back. Also, Wentz is out. Quentin Nelson will be out for some. Like, this offense is going to be severely tested and limited in ways that it wasn't. And I do have an overall theory that last offseason was so tough that a lot of those rookies from last year will really overperform in year 2. I don't think Jonathan Taylor is it. I think his carries will be greatly taken because there'll be more health at his position, more kind of having a share carry. So he is my biggest stay away at any position. I don't even have him in my top 50 at all spots.
He's a guy that doesn't
not touch him.
He had a couple of moments.
He did.
But he just didn't really consistently pass the eye test enough for me. When you pull up the fantasy production, yes, the 4th most productive running back in fantasy football
in
this
standard
year,
leagues, yeah.
And you can use that for his argument. But I watched the Colts a couple of times last year, and it was just one of those where it was like,
really bad.
I don't see it. But again, maybe he'll boom this year.
The other thing, Justin, haven't we seen this before? Wisconsin running backs so productive in college. It's the system, guys. Monty Ball, Melvin Gordon, Ron Dane.
Yeah.
It's that system, and if you can't figure it out, if you can't have a little more wiggle to you, a little more vision once you're not just running behind those phenomenal Badgers O-lines in the cold, in Scotties, Saturday after Saturday, things change. So I'm just not a Jonathan Taylor believer. I'm glad we had that talk.
Wisconsin running backs get off the bus, man, and go for 200 yards.
100%.
It's just what they do.
Yeah, truly. More credit to them. Let's go to wide receivers where it's really going to be wide open. I mean, you could go any which way. Kale and I sticking with the ADP favorite. You going with Tyreek Hill, who I have seen, for example, on Yahoo, is the top ADP wide receiver. What had you going with the Chiefs wideout, who I am the lowest on, ranking him 5th, and regular listeners to the show might have an inkling to why that is.
Part of it is, with Kansas City losing Sammy Watkins, I think Hill's targets are going to go up on the outside. You obviously have the big play potential because he's just an elite burner, one of the fastest football players I've ever seen. And it's just one of those. They're gonna throw the football a lot. It's an Andy Reid offense.
Right, you're buying that offense.
I just feel like it's Tyreek's year. I will say I love Devonta Adams. He's been my wide receiver 1 for about a half decade now. Like, there's not a wide receiver in football that I enjoy watching as much as Devonta Adams.
Mountain West, so he's not.
Fresno State guy coming off of an 18 touchdown season. Like, you can use.
Yikes.
You look at any numbers. I mean, he's gone for. He's at 120 plus targets in 4 of the last 5 seasons. They force feed him the football.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit worried about the situation, the locker room in Green Bay, just given the uncertainty with him and Aaron Rodgers. Both of those guys are in situations where it doesn't really look like they're going to be in Green Bay much longer. Right. But the counter is, these are guys that are going to want to put up big numbers. It's not like they're going to phone it in. They want a big contract elsewhere, or they want to get extended. So, I might have overthought this one a little bit, to be honest. The more we're going into this, I think I'd probably put Devontae 1 and Tyreek Hill 2, but you can't go wrong with either of those guys, in my opinion.
It's crazy. In standard leagues last year, they were neck and neck, 243 to 241 for Devontae. Tyreek playing 15 games, Devontae 14. It's going to be really interesting. You're right. Tyreek has one less guy to compete against for touches. Green Bay famously hasn't added anyone for like 2 years straight.
Devontae has nobody to compete with.
It's like him and Bobby Tunyon in the end zone and Aaron Jones.
Yeah, exactly. That is their entire offense. And that's what makes Aaron Rodgers'
zeroing in on
success
those three,
so like mind-blowing in some ways. When you look at the fact, like the numbers that he was able to put up last year, and you look at the weapons, I mean, it's not like they've got like Randy Moss on the outside next to Devontae Adams, next to DeAndre Hopkins. It's only those dudes and then A-Rod.
Totally. So, yeah, and Tyreek Hill, gosh, I'm almost surprised to see that, but he was insanely productive a year ago. And so maybe I'm overthinking it by going fifth. He is one of those guys who can go off for 30, 40, 50 any given week. And
the consistency
then
could
once
be an
in a
issue.
while we'll have a 9-point week or what have you. And it's why Calvin Ridley with no Julio to compete again. Justin Jefferson, Thielen's still there, but Jefferson in that offense,
he's the guy now.
Kirk's shown, that offense, you can count on them to go for 4,000 plus every year, and those two wide receivers will handle the bulk of that. Diggs in Buffalo, all those guys have a little more of the share to where I lean with them. And in fact, I think in my top 50, no spoilers, Tyreek Hill not even the highest ranked Chiefs offensive player, which whatever.
Well, I mean, I think it's when you get into the argument of like positional value and like there's like 3 tight ends that are so much better than everyone else that if you don't land one of those 3, it's pretty much 6 one way, half a dozen the other on anybody else in the league. And I feel the same way about quarterbacks to an extent. Like once you get out of the top like 6 or 7 guys, 8 through 25, you're basically the same thing. And that's why I don't understand why some of these, you'll see it every year in a fantasy draft, especially with players that are a little bit inexperienced. A couple of these quarterbacks will go and then people start to panic and you'll see people taking the quarter. It's like, well, all right, I don't care if I end up with Derek Carr in the 13th round because he's going to put up the same numbers as Tannehill or whoever you want to use.
And we'll be like 60 deep on wide receivers where I feel like, well, in a pinch, I could start him in my flex.
Exactly.
Quarterback, 18 deep. And most standard leagues are, 10, 12? So you're pretty comfortable. Running back.
I've got one big question for you,
We already
Dre.
get out the top 5, and it's tricky. Yeah, lay it on me, brother.
You've got, this happens twice for you, and it doesn't happen for me or Justin. You have 2 guys from the Minnesota wide receiver core and 2 guys from the Tennessee wide receiver core. Are you not worried about them splitting catches?
Oh, you got Julio at 6. Holy cow.
I'm bullish on Julio.
I like that, though, because I'm really... I already mentioned that,
right?
I'm high on the Tennessee passing offense. I think it's really going to jump to the next level. I think Tannehill's played really well over the last couple of years. And he's got the arm for it. Like 2 big-bodied wide receivers that you can stretch the field with and just wear your opponents down with Derrick Henry, beat him on play action every now and then. Like it's just setting up so nicely. I think you talked me into it, or I talked myself into it with your logic, but...
I know it's tricky with Tennessee. That's the harder one for me to sell myself on, but I think they've just gone all in on offense, and all in on Tannehill, and all in on that receiving core to where they can support it.
Former linebacker going all in on offense. It'd be nice if we could do the same here.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, they're also going to have to score like 38 points a game because that defense is hot garbo.
Oh, yeah. It's insane what Vrabel's done to that D. I mean, it's what you just said. Like, it's crazy that a former linebacker could just do that all in. Minnesota, I feel more confident about. It might not be as sexy. And look, they probably won't both duos won't be top 10, but I feel confident enough.
At least one of them.
To will they both end up in the top 18, 20 to where I think these rankings won't look too bad.
I think they're both top 15 guys, even fairly confidently. I mean, again, like you never know. It could be a situation where someone like Cortland Sutton, all of a sudden comes around and him and Judy put up big numbers. Then maybe these guys drop down a little bit, but they're going to get plenty of targets. And I like that you included Thielen too, just kind of talking about the Vikings, because while, Jefferson was awesome last year, looking at the numbers, most times people kind of come down to earth a little bit in that sophomore season. Yeah. So I think deceptively Thielen could be good value, because I bet you could get him later with people eyeing Jefferson in those early rounds.
I agree, and actually averaged more fantasy points per game last year than Justin Jefferson.
Especially in PPR.
More.
Like I had Thielen last year, and he was one of those guys that was kind of frustrating, because it would be like 6 points, 7 points, 42 points, 38 points, 5 points, 4 points, 41 points.
Yeah, the Minnesota offense became a little more streaky than like the steady Eddie you'd expect, especially with
all the talent that they have and like all the different guys. Why does it click so well one week and then they look like a completely different offense the next?
Yeah, that's really a great question. It's a question that users of the number one sportsbook in all the land never ask themselves. No one's ever asked themselves, why is DraftKings Sportsbook act so inconsistent? No, always consistent. And if you're not in now as football season's around the corner, I don't know what you're doing. On top of that, new users can bet $1 to win $200. Any football market, they will give you $200 in free bets. That, even better, is in 8 different $25 free bets. Those are the best. Won $1,000 on one of those once, 4-legger. That was a beaut.
Little flex.
Yeah, no, that great time. So get on that. Get in on all the fun. You're a football expert. You listen to this pod every week. Let's get in on some fun NFL props. Let's use our fantasy wisdom and knowledge to our advantage on the DraftKings Sportsbook app. It's a blast. It's a place where, for example, Teddy Bridgewater just announced the starter today. Well, you could have placed a bet on that and won a lot of money. You can do that all at DraftKings Sportsbook. Download their app, the DraftKings Sportsbook app now, and use that promo code DNVR to receive that great new offer. And they will match your first deposit bonus up to $1,000. That's $1,000 in free bets. It's such a deal. Must be 21 or older. Colorado only. New customers only. Restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details. Gambling problem, call 1-800-522-4700.
Before we move on, I need to shout out just a couple of wide receivers that I have way different than you guys.
Yeah, let's do it.
I have Allen Robinson at 5.
I saw that.
Purely because I am bullish on the fact that Allen Robinson, I think, is a Hall of Fame talent that has been wasted by poor quarterback play.
Wow.
And
spicy takes. I dig it. Keep him rolling.
I just think this is going to be the best quarterback play he's probably had in his entire career once Justin Fields starts, and I think he's going to put up absolute monster numbers.
Hey, don't sleep on the Red Rocket either. Andy Dalton.
Yeah, he puts up numbers.
If you want a quarterback to get the football to your wide receiver, he's going to be fine. I'm not saying I would want him as my team as a Super Bowl coach. Most seasons, Andy Dalton was actually a fairly competent fantasy quarterback.
And then I also have Terry McLaurin and Jerry Jeudy in there, and I purely just think they're going to be, in PPR leagues, catch monsters. I think they're going to catch 100 balls, and that's going to, in PPR leagues, that's going to score you a lot of points.
Terry is a really interesting one. I had a long debate with myself about him and Tyler Lockett in that 11 or 12-13 spot, and I ended up giving Lockett the slight edge. I love McLaurin, though, from the time I covered him at the Senior Bowl, and he'll probably start really well, right, with Fitzpatrick. It's that second half of the season that's got us skeptic. That whole football team offense between Gibson, Logan Thomas, I think a lot of guys that maybe you won't see in our top 10s, but we've got our eyes on outside.
Yeah. I think I had McLaurin at like 12. So, I am high on him.
Right.
I had him at number 27 overall on my big board. Big play potential. I mean, if you want a guy that could go for like an 80-yard touchdown, there aren't more people in the league that have a better chance of doing so than McLaurin. Jerry Jeudy I really like, though, because I agree with Kale. He's going to just rack up those targets. Now, obviously, you hope that the drops aren't an issue this season.
No.
I'm not worried about that.
And how wide open is that offense with Bridgewater?
That's the important thing, is how efficient is that passing offense as a whole. But I think with the return of Cortland Sutton, it's going to open things up for him. He shouldn't always be having to go against the team's number one corner, or if he is, maybe not the entire game. Hell yeah, Kale. I hope Judy goes off. I got a Jerry Judy jersey in my closet, so nobody's pulling for him more than me.
I want to touch on Allen Robinson just a second longer because I think we kind of missed an opportunity to talk about David Montgomery and the running backs. David Montgomery, after the bye week for the Bears, 20 points, 25, 23, 24. He was on an absolute tear. Of course, Tyree Cohen was out. They've now brought in Jamal Williams.
That's the only thing that scares me about this Bears
O-line.
backfield.
Right.
Kind of going to Kale's argument where it's a running back by committee. I think it's 3 guys that are going to end up with around 100 carries
exactly.
each. And
that was Montgomery's issue last year. And then, Robinson doesn't have those issues, but it is a greater issue of, geez, how much can I buy into the Bears offense? Because I'm with you on, the field stuff is a great point. How long am I, it's the reverse Fitzpatrick.
In PPR, he was a top 10 wide receiver last year
I know. Oh, he killed it.
Abysmal quarterback play.
He killed it. He really, and some of the worst O-line play you will ever see in professional football. Fourth and one, like goal line from it, they have to run an outside toss. They're so bad on the O-line. They can't get 1 yard up a gap. Those are things that,
Any concerns about the weather? It's obviously gets really cold in Chicago. That's like one of the things I try and keep in the back of my mind a little bit. If it comes down to maybe less so at wide receiver, more so with like a kicker or something. Am I going to take a kicker that's going to be kicking in Lambeau, or am I going to be taking a kicker that's going to be kicking in South Beach?
Quarterback too.
But I consider weather way more when I'm drafting quarterbacks than necessarily skill position players, but that's just me.
And with running backs, you'll kind of do the reversal, I love me a good running, a bell cow from the black and blue in November and December. Give me that.
He's going to get those looks.
100%. Right. And it's what the great point Kale made about Derrick Henry when we were talking running backs, how like end of the season, the guy's just carrying the load and churning them out. We kind of got to mine anything on your 6 through 10 you want to touch on before we move on to tight ends, which is always a fun one.
Just real briefly, I actually guess I have him at 3, but you guys aren't as high on him. Kale doesn't even have him in his top 10. It doesn't look like you do either. Neither of you oh no, yeah, you do. You got an 8. Sorry. DeAndre Hopkins. I have him at 3. Dre's got him at 8. Kale does not have him in his top 10.
I got to be honest, this was a mistake. Yep.
Oversight?
Just oversight. Okay. Yep.
No worries.
Okay. That's all I wanted to ask, because maybe Kale had a spicy take like, this Arizona offense is dog water, I almost said a curse word. I don't believe in Kingsbury, but no, just an oversight. It happens. I get it. But even you don't have him super high on your list. Where is your reservation on DeAndre Hopkins?
I was so low on him last year. He kind of turned me around. I don't love that offense. Cliff has really let me down as far as like bringing any sort of innovation or wide open.
Not nearly as creative as it should be with the guys that they have in that locker room.
They didn't know how to use Kenyon Drake a year ago, man. It was nuts. So, I'm like, okay, yeah, he's a reliable top 10 wide receiver. And, yeah, I'm not pounding the other thing about 6 through 10 on these rankings.
Relatively similar.
I am almost certain the way things will fall that I probably won't get any of those guys. If the board doesn't fall my way and I'm forced to prioritize my very top wide receivers over running backs or tight ends, which I wasn't able to get, even maybe a couple quarterbacks, that could happen. Almost certainly, though, once the Julios, the DK Metcalfs, the DeAndre Hopkins are still around, I have other priorities. I'm trying to knock out my RB2. Maybe there's still a tight end I really value. Maybe there's a quarterback I really value. It would be a letdown if this was like a first-round pick for me. Or an early
That's
second.
Fair. That's definitely fair. I think 3 in hindsight, probably a little high. I just kept moving him up for some reason. I think on my original list, I had him below Diggs, Metcalf, and Justin Jefferson, maybe even Calvin Ridley as well. And then I just kept tinkering. Ended up all the way at number 3. But that's how these lists always go. I do the same thing when I do like preseason rankings. There'll be one team that starts at 9 and somehow finishes like 5th when it's all said and done.
And we should say, Hop, huge difference, standard or PPR. Like, he had many catches last year that he was the 4th best per PPR. Standard, just 10th best. So big switch there.
And that's always an important caveat. You need to know this thing when you're going into your, half point PPR, full point PPR, or a standard league. All of these matter. All of them are going to greatly influence how you decide to draft. In PPR, once I have my second running back, I'm pretty much just like stacking up as many productive wide receivers as I can. I want a solid third running back that I can trust. But in a standard league, I'm probably trying to get like 3 or 4 running backs, and I'm not as worried 100%. About the wide receivers. It just changes your mindset.
It's a great point to make, and something we will be talking about more in the next podcast, where we'll get into more draft theories and team construction. But yeah, you got to know your league. You got to know even how the board stacks when you look at that draft board when you go into the draft room. There's just the more you know your surroundings and how your league operates, the more you're going to have an edge in being able to get what you want where you want without having to overpay on everything or be surprised at any point.
Again, we can talk about this more on the next episode, but this was actually something I kind of learned the hard way a couple of years ago. I joined a league that I'm still in today. It's a league where you start 2 quarterbacks each week. I've never been in a league like it's a lot of fun. I'm doing really high scoring.
I love those, especially for Dynasty. I think they're so fun.
But it completely changes your draft strategy. You know what I mean? Because you need 2 legitimate starting quarterbacks, and it changes how much you prioritize wide receivers and running backs. It's just a whole different ordeal, but it's fun, man. That's the beauty of fantasy football. You can get as wonky as you want, or you can just keep things simple, and that's kind of beautiful in its own right. It's nice to just, touchdowns I get points, yards I get points. That's it. Sometimes it's nice to just be simple.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's what I really love about fantasy football is the ever evolving and changing different formats. One thing that's really changed in the last few years with fantasy football is how much we've had to value the very top of the tight end position.
Totally. Because
Travis Kelce almost broke the NFL record for receiving yards, not for a tight end, period, last year. He did break the tight end record, of course. Then you have Darren Waller, who's been similarly historically great. Kittle had some injuries a year ago, but you go back to 2019, you're talking about another guy who was putting up
absurd
otherworldly production. So yeah, you've got 3 guys who you essentially have to treat like first rounders at the tight end position. That's not something we've typically had to do as fantasy owners. And then if you aren't able to get one of those guys, you're kind of scrambling, and you got to figure out the rest of the position. So this is really,
it's a weird position. It's one of the hardest positions to draft. It's that fine line of once you secure, and maybe Travis Kelce, a Kittle, a Darren Waller, somebody like that could be worth taking, especially if you have a late pick in the first round in a deeper league, or an early pick in the second round or something like that. But, one of the things Dre and I were talking about before is just the gap, once you get out of those top, I don't know, maybe you could say 4 or 5 guys. I think it's really more like 3.
I think it's 3, and then the gap is
gap is just so steep, and it's at that point, it's not going to matter if you take a tight end in the 5th round or the 13th round. You just need to get a guy that's going to be on the field.
I also, if anyone's doing keeper leagues and it's your first year drafting, spending a first-round pick on a tight end in a keeper league is, if it's one of those 3 guys, because of positional scarcity, is probably not a bad move.
I like that.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Travis Kelce,
right.
He'd totally be worth the investment. That's a great point, Kel.
So then with ADP, I'm assuming we have a consensus on the top 3.
No, Kale's got Waller at 7.
So this is purely because this year I am avoiding offenses that I don't trust completely. And I don't trust this Raiders offense after the offensive line upheaval at all. Yeah. And so any offenses where I'm just completely out on, I'm knocking those guys down.
Hey, I like that you're consistent with your logic. That's one thing I would give advice people to in your fantasy draft. Whatever your parameters are, whatever your individual rules are,
100%,
just stay committed to them. Because if you do back and forth, you get wishy-washy. If you change what you're doing, you change how you run your team every week, it's going to drive you mad. And if you stay to your principles, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some, but at least you have the comfort in there. So I like that Kale's sticking to it.
It's a golden rule for betting as well. Just stay consistent, stay by you. And honestly, I really think it's going to work out for you more often than not, because it's the things you know best. So
exactly.
That's going to pay off.
I like Waller a lot, though,
interesting.
man.
Yeah,
as much as I think that
He's that
the
entire
criticisms of the Raiders offense are fair, and again, you know, they haven't been able to figure out the passing stuff yet with the wide receivers, despite, you know, taking multiple first-round wide receivers in the last decade. I trust Derek Carr more than most people do. I think he's a little bit underrated. I think he's going to do a good job of getting Waller red zone targets, and I don't know. I just think he feels like a John Gruden player. Like, John Gruden's like, I love this guy, man. Like, Darren Waller. I'm going to get him 5,500 targets this season, man. Like,
I mean, also, most people listening are probably in PPR, half PPR leagues.
Good point.
And he's going to get a ton of catches because Derek Carr checks down to his tight ends.
A
ton.
Yeah, and has not many other options because you got Henry Ruggs, who's more of a deep threat decoy.
He's running open 80 yards down the field. But it doesn't matter because he can't get him the ball.
And did you also have Kittle number 1, Kale? So you went extra spicy.
I do, yeah. I have Kittle number 1. I just expect some regression from that Chiefs offense. Not that it's not going to be incredibly explosive, just a slight amount of a regression just because they don't have a true wide receiver 2 this year.
Well, and it's not like Kittle doesn't have the talent. I mean, when he is at his peak, I think saying George Kittle is the best tight end in football is not an outlandish statement.
And to be fair, that's a 1A, 1B thing. Like, it's not like this is semantics.
Yeah, and those three guys all averaging over 15 points per game in a PPR, even in the drastically injury-riddled season Kittle had. Everyone else below 12. So, massive divide. Let's get into, though, 4 through 10, where things get more interesting. I went Bobby Tunyon just because he's got all those touchdowns. It does seem like his role's only going to grow. And then I've got Mark Andrews. I think ADP is kind of crazy putting rookie Kyle Pitts 4th overall. I would not touch him.
It's too high, man. He's going to be an incredible player. And he might even have a really good season.
He might have a historically great season for a tight end, but it's still not going to be like...
He's not going to put up Kelsey numbers. He's not going to put up Waller numbers.
The rule of thumb, I wouldn't draft him as a starter. So quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end.
Your tight end too, though, you would take him?
You need to address those positions first before you can draft Pitts. So if you're drafting him before the 6th round, I disagree with you.
Oh, I do too. It's just too unproven at this point. Like, we're all in on his potential. Again, you know, some of these things, sometimes these evaluations are not what we think of their football potential or what we'll even think they'll do.
Exactly, it's just, right. It's production-based. It's not...
It's all fantasy. Yeah. This is not emotion, just logic. I mean, it's the same reason why, like, you know, I had Tyreek Hill as my number 1 wide receiver. I'm not going to not take the guy because he's a Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver. Like,
right.
He's a beast.
Right. And you're higher on Andrews. You guys are both higher on Fant. So let's talk it out.
I'm bullish on Fant this year. I just think he's got all the tools to be the next elite tight end in football. And if the Broncos weren't entirely injury-ridden last year, I think he would have blown up last year and not this year.
Right.
What worries me about Fant is just how dependent it's going to be, you know, on solid quarterback play for him to boom this year. I think Kale's spot on. I think he has the skill set. I think if we're talking about some of the more athletic tight ends in the league, he certainly belongs in that conversation. A red zone threat. I also like that he has the potential to, you know, some tight ends, all their work is going to be within 10, 12 yards of the line of scrimmage. Fant's a guy you can target 25, 30 yards down the field because he moves well enough to get down there. I don't know. I just worry about the quarterback, and the more I think about it, I actually would probably put Fant a little bit lower on my list than I have him here. I would put Tunyon higher just because of red zone targets. I think Mark Andrews is going to be an awesome red zone target for Baltimore. I mean, you know what they do with the running game, but it's just going to create so many opportunities where they can just run a little play action and have him just kind of run over the corner wide open at the pylon, touchdown, easy money. Where are you guys at with TJ Hawkinson, though? Obviously taken above Noah Fant, his running mate at Iowa. We haven't really seen it kind of click in the way that people were hoping it would at the next level yet.
He was really good last year, but not elite last year. Certainly not elite.
Not a top 10 tight end in the NFL draft.
Certainly not in fantasy-wise. I just like the fact that I know the last 2 years, Jared Goff has thrown to his tight ends a ton, and that's kind of why I put him at 5.
Well, maybe he's arguably their best target, and last year was the 5th most productive in PPR's overall points.
That's higher than I would have guessed.
A little lower on average.
Yeah.
Fant is behind him, sandwiched between Hawkinson and Ingram, all first-round tight ends. Ingram, I have buyer's remorse with Ingram, and that's playing into Fant. Such an incredible athlete, right? Such a mismatch at the tight end position. But if that offense isn't there for you, you're only going to go so far. Big believer in Fant. A little more skeptical about the Broncos off. The other thing about the Broncos offense is there is so much depth. There are so many mouths to feed at wide receiver, at running back, at tight end, to where I think that'll really benefit the Broncos from football reasons, but it might hurt some of their individuals in fantasy.
It's the Dallas Cowboys conundrum. Like if you watched the Dallas Cowboys last year and you had any of those players, it was really frustrating because at any given point you're rooting for your guy. You know, whether Michael Gallup, CeeDee Lamb, whoever it is, and it always feels like the other guy is who scores in that scenario. But that's kind of fantasy football in a nutshell, right? Like that's what makes it frustrating, but it's also what makes it so satisfying when your guy hits.
And I'll defend the fact that I don't have Gesicki in the top 10.
I'm counting on him making big leaps, obviously. Based on what we've seen last year, he wouldn't be a top 10 tight end. I do like I guess his relationship with Tua. And
Tua had some success with OJ, right?
Yeah,
OJ was there. Yeah. So at least there's a track record of throwing to the... That's another offense. I really don't know much what to make of it.
I've watched both
have to
Dolphins.
Figure out a lot.
I've watched both Dolphins preseason games, and I know preseason don't read too much into it, but it sure seems like Mike Gesicki is gonna be Tua's favorite target, which is why I put him. He was off of my top 10 before I watched him last week, and I bumped him way up.
I mean, they don't have running backs. Their wide receivers are kind of not exactly household names.
They can't stay on the field. They have another. They could, Preston Williams, former CSU guy, former #1 recruit in the country before he signed with Tennessee.
Yeah,
he's been pretty productive in a limited role. Played in 16 games over the last 2 years. Had about 800 yards. I think like 55 catches, 90 targets, 7 touchdowns. It's just staying on the field. They've had a hell of a time keeping any of these guys healthy. Parker struggled to stay on the field too. I don't know. I like Gesicki as their passing option, but I don't think I would take him very early. I would feel much better if I had one of those top 5 tight ends and Gesicki, I was able to steal him, a little bit later. But, like Kale said, I do think he is going to be Tua's #1 target and potentially a sleeper that you could steal away in leagues where people aren't, paying attention quite as well.
Beautiful. All right, let's get to quarterbacks. Our top 10's not so important. Did you have all these guys in your top 50, Justin?
No.
I didn't either.
I only have the top 6 guys in the top 50.
Yeah, I think I did the exact same thing. And
mine's the same, yeah.
We
all have the same top 6 guys.
So we have the same top 6. Which is crazy. You can't say that about any other position we've come up with.
Are they exactly the same? They're super close. I have Tannehill a little higher and Dak a little bit lower than you guys do.
Yeah, and I lowered Dak just a little. Again, I'm skeptical about that offense. But it really speaks to what Justin was saying a couple positions ago. There's no need to prioritize quarterbacks. You can wait. And Matt Ryan, my 9th ranked quarterback, Matthew Stafford,
he's going to put up great numbers.
I'll be ecstatic to get those guys. Ecstatic. And I've already have my flex taken care of before I have to draft.
I can tell you right now, Matthew Stafford's one of my top fantasy targets, and he's my 10th ranked quarterback.
Right, because in that offense,
he's
those tight ends, those wide receivers, why not?
He's going to put up big numbers, and the value. It's just one of those things. Yeah, it'd be awesome to get Patrick Mahomes, but you're probably going to have to blow a first-round pick on him when he's not worth it.
Yep.
He's not when we talk about the positional value in fantasy. Again, this isn't a Mahomes shot.
No,
this is just
of course.
Mahomes is my 13th ranked fantasy football player on my top 50. He's not a top 10 pick in my estimation.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. And Dak, he's coming off the injury. We haven't seen him in this type of offense before. He's having to familiarize himself. Herbert, look at any of the props for Herbert. Everything has him regressing, even though he's going to play 2 more games than he did a year ago. So
I'm the only one that has a discrepancy here. I have Dak really high. purely just because if he's healthy, which I think he's going to be, they're just going to have to throw the ball so much to even stay in games because of that defense.
Great receivers too, which always helps your cause.
Exactly. So that was sort of my thought on Dak. And then the only other thing is I sort of preferred guys who are going to have a lot of running touchdowns because you get more points out of them, which is why I have Kyler and Lamar high. But
that's kind of the big thing. That's what's changed, these last couple of years is unless you're getting, a Patrick Mahomes or an Aaron Rodgers, one of those guys that's going to stand in the pocket and pick you apart, the most valuable fantasy quarterbacks are those guys that give you the rushing component. It is Kyler Murray. It is Lamar Jackson, even Josh Allen to an extent, gives you a lot of rushing points. I mean, you can, especially I had Kyler Murray last year. There were some weeks, he's getting you an extra 8-9 points a week just from his rushing stats. And that's, in a close game, that can be the difference.
His rushing was huge. I think a lot of people will be surprised there's no Baker in here, So that's just the deal. So that's our quarterbacks. And again, you got to pound those running backs. You got to really find your tight ends, find your wide receivers. Yeah, Mahomes, you get Mahomes and none of your running back tight end targets were there in round one. I will not be crying if I get Mahomes round one,
No, it's all situational. Just because I have him 13th on my board doesn't mean I would necessarily not take him in the first round if, the cards put out. If my top 5 running backs went off the board, my top 3 wide receivers, at that point, I'm probably considering taking my number 1 quarterback or my number 1 tight end just because of positional value and the gap between those guys and the rest of the field. But, it's all situational. You just don't want to overplay your hand. Don't make your pick necessarily only based on what other people are doing. If everybody else is taking quarterbacks, it's easy to get in that moment. Oh, God, I got to get a quarterback because they're all going to go. Yeah. They're not. No. And you're going to be okay.
They're just not. Yeah, and with that, let's look at our favorite sleepers and our biggest stayaways. I just gave you 5 there. Will Fuller, I'm bullish on Will Fuller. Top 10 wide receiver last year. In Miami, I think he might be the guy who kind of unlocks Tua. I've talked about Nyheim Hines. I've talked about Bobby Tunyon and Matt Ryan. Trey Sermon's the only guy I haven't touched on.
We both had him on there.
I'm a big buyer on, obviously, Kyle Shanahan running offenses. It's another topic we have touched on repeatedly. Big Raheem Mostert, but Sermon is a guy I'll try to target to have on my bench as a bit of a running back insurance.
I mean, he was the guy that came on so strong down the stretch for Ohio State, kind of looked like that running back everybody thought he had the potential to be. I really like his potential in a Kyle Shanahan offense. I like Mostert as well, but I'm glad that we both have him on there because I felt pretty good about that. And I'm also glad that me and Kale both have Michael Gallup on here. Shout out our guy, MG, the pride of Colorado State.
Yep. Big Michael Gallup guy.
Big Michael
Gallup guy.
He's going to be Dallas's number 3 wide receiver, and again, that can be very frustrating when you're sitting there watching CeeDee Lamb eat. Last year I had Lamb and Gallup, and it was always trying to figure out, is this going to be a Lamb week or a Gallup week? Right. Like, which one of these guys is going to go off? But I still think he's a top 30 wide receiver in terms of fantasy value, and I think that he doesn't necessarily have the same name recognition that like CeeDee Lamb did, coming out of OU, or Amari Cooper, a Biletnikoff winner. I think you could probably steal him a little bit later than some of these other guys.
I have him in my sleepers purely just because I think you're going to be able to get him in some leagues, especially if you're in a smaller league, maybe undrafted, which seems crazy, but Michael Gallup is a huge value play for me.
Well, yeah, he's one of those super deep wide receivers where it's like, let someone else prioritize Julio Jones with the 15th pick after they drafted Tyreek Hill 5th overall.
And you're one injury away from him getting 10 to 15 targets a game.
Damn straight. Yeah, you're 100% right. And so I like that, and it actually looks like we've got some decent overlap here. You've touched on Swift already, Kale, and Mostert's the guy I talked about while I was talking about Trey Sermon. And a guy I certainly was high on coming into last year as well.
Tana Trill, baby, or Tana Thrill.
He's great. I love Tana.
We're all high on Ryan Tannehill, right?
I'm actually kind of surprised he's as highly ranked in ADP as he is.
I think people are kind of like we are, where
Tannehill's
we're at
inside the top 10.
We're at 2.5 seasons of him being a top 5 fantasy quarterback. When do we just stop ignoring that he's an elite fantasy quarterback?
Yeah, and he just added Julio, so I mean the There's definitely some logical thinking in this.
I mean, I have him at 7, which just a couple of years ago would have seemed
it'd be
absurd to
insane.
say.
No, boy, he's such an appealing coin. He's Orion coined it like dunks and threes is all he does. You know, he's got those RPO runs, and then he's taking those deep shots, and you just added Julio, which is going to make him dangerous.
And they're designed perfectly to do it. You know, it's not only that he wants to play that way, but Tennessee, they didn't try and change the mold. They didn't try and make him be a different quarterback. All right, we'll get you those receivers then.
Exactly. And our biggest stayaways here, we're being polite. Bad offenses that Kale's already touched on. Justin's
Najee
the only
Harris,
one who
that
actually
kills me. You're so right, though.
filled
You're
out
so
a full
right.
10. So look, I love Najee Harris as a player, prospect, person. Everything I hear, see, read on the kid is phenomenal. My concern is Big Ben and the fact that Big Ben's mobility has been so severely limited the past 2 years that the Steelers are forced to run an offense out of the gun. And, so Najee is just not going to benefit from that. I've said my spiel on Jonathan Taylor. Tom Brady is the representative for the entire Bucs passing offense.
Just avoid him.
I don't think it's a coincidence. We've now gone through all the major positions and have yet to basically mention anyone from the Super Bowl champs.
Is it just too many mouths to feed for you?
It's too many mouths, and it's an offense that's probably going to skew a little more conservative anyways. And we saw that last year. And Montgomery, I touched on when we talked about Allen Robinson, and the Cincy passing attack we touched on a little with Mixon. I like Mixon because I think he's the key to that offense and is the only way. But the passing attack terrifies me. Higgins terrifies me. Joe Burrow terrifies me. It's all a little scary.
Jamar Chase was my 50th ranked player on my big board, and
It's gutsy.
even then it was one of those, it was more just like I'm banking on his potential, but I agree with you that I hate everything about that Bengals passing offense. I will avoid Joe Burrow like the plague, not because I don't believe in him, but because he's coming off of that injury, and I don't believe in that offensive line. Probably should have had him on my stay away list, but a couple other people here, Trevor Lawrence.
Rager's a good one.
I don't really know what to expect from this Jacksonville offense, and that's really what worries me about it. I don't think he's going to be horrible. He might even be worth stashing on your roster, but he makes me nervous. Big Ben can't move anymore, and neither can Cam Newton, so I'm going to avoid both those guys. I'm not a Clyde Edwards-Helaire guy. I just saw way too much of him running into the backs of his offensive line over the last couple of years, and the same could be said for Melvin Gordon. Chase Claypool, I think he comes down to life a little bit. That's not an anti-thing. I don't like the Pittsburgh passing offense, so I'm avoiding him and Big Ben in tandem. And the last couple of guys here, just Jalen Reagor. Philly is a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
T.Y. Hilton can't stay healthy. Gronk is old, and I don't like that Tampa Bay passing
I'm amazed
offense.
that Gronk is still top 10 ADP. I don't know what people are doing. I mean, what people are doing is they're going by name value.
Yeah, it's name recognition
Prediction,
alone.
yeah.
And then I don't remember having Logan. Maybe I had Logan Thompson there. I think I had Zach Ertz, the
Zach Ertz makes sense.
Philly tight end. But again,
Yeah,
it's just,
that's my mistake. Instead of Zach Ertz, I put that.
oh, we're all good,
No
man.
worries.
Same division, both tight ends. I see where the line of thinking is. Kale, you have any thoughts on these stay away guys? Anybody you see on here that you like that you would not stay away from?
I actually agree with everybody you guys put on here because it pretty much follows the same principle of my catch-all that I put down. So
Avoid bad offenses. Hey, you want to be good at fantasy football? Draft good fantasy football players.
I mean, it really is. I used to make a top 10 of like the offenses I liked most to target. Like clearly we're high on Green Bay. And there's a couple other, Tampa Bay, Minnesota has a decent amount of. That's another guy. Like, you can wait around for Kirk Cousins at quarterback. He'll be just fine.
especially if he's your second quarterback.
Yeah,
like you get that
right.
dude in the 11th round or something like
he's
that.
gonna.
Like,
I mean, in 17 games, he's gonna throw for 4,000 yards. Like,
Easy.
Oh,
he might
probably
4,500,
4,800,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there it is. That is our season preview. Tune in next week where we will have you set on more strategies and what have you. And then the season is going to be upon us, and we will answer all your questions, eat some crow, celebrate some big dubs, and do it all together with you. JM, love doing this. Excited for season 2. Kale, real pleasure having you behind the board. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll be back next week.